Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks, Pete. Thank you, Althea. It's such an encouraging place to be every time I'm here. I love singing with a group of people when it's not in church. You know, there aren't many places where that happens. So I want to spend as much time as we can hearing your questions and having a conversation, but I'll start by just telling you a little bit about who I am and why I decided to run for Congress in 2018, right? So I'm a Lancaster County native. I was born and raised in this community, grew up out in Leola, and went to Conestoga Valley Schools, graduated from Lancaster Mennonite, what feels like a long time ago. And an important part of my story that shaped my path and a lot of my values was a sad one. And it started when I was just a baby. We lost my dad in a plane crash. So my mom was widowed with 3 little kids. And I was the youngest in the family. And you can imagine that she survived that loss with the help of Social Security survivor's benefits. So as somebody who has depended upon our social contract and what we invest in as Americans, I just want to say that we need to look for ways to expand Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and not be contracting them. And I'm concerned that that's the trajectory that we're on under current leadership. When I was about 5, my mom remarried my stepdad, who also had lost his first wife to cancer and had 1 daughter. So we had this blended family. Neither of my parents had college degrees, and my stepdad never finished high school. But they had a strong work ethic. He had a lot of experience working with his hands, and so they did what a lot of people do, and they started a small business right on Main Street in Leola. They started a paint store and a painting contractor business, which is fun to come full circle with my friend Pete and seeing what he's doing with paint all these years later. So I grew up in that business. I started working there from the time I remember, learning about the values of hard work, about doing what you say you're gonna do, about doing business with integrity, doing business with our neighbors, with people we went to church with. And I learned a lot about hard work, right? And also, that church that we went to was Mennonite. So I grew up Mennonite, and this might be the first time I see Chet Byler in the audience too. Thank you for your run and stepping into this space that we had 3 Lancaster Mennonite alumni running at the same time. My opponent in this race also graduated from Lancaster Mennonite, grew up Amish, I grew up Mennonite, so this might be a first. But what I learned, I saw my church in the 1980s out in Leola, not the most progressive church in Lancaster County, resettling refugee families. And that made a big impact on me. And I saw that and a lot of other activities that I think embodied what I learned from the Bible, going to church every Sunday, every Wednesday, learning about what Scripture said, which is, other than loving God, our greatest responsibility is to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so that has informed my life, my values, my politics, and the policies that I fight for. So these are my values. Knowing life is short, you gotta make it count. You don't know how much time you've got, so step up and take big risks. Work hard and love your neighbor as yourself. So I've tried to put that to work in my career here in Pennsylvania. I've worked only here in Pennsylvania. After college, I moved to Pittsburgh for a decade and fell in love with that city. Realized that the sons and daughters of steelworkers and the immigrants and refugees to that city had the same values as my Mennonite family from the edge of farm fields in Lancaster County. That we have more in common than we don't. And that's a really important thing to remember in a moment like this that feels so polarized and so partisan. I know we don't agree on everything, right? We don't agree on every policy, every platform. But let's remember what we have in common and try to find that first. So I fought for economic development, affordable housing, trying to create good jobs in the east end of Pittsburgh when I lived there, and ended up staying for a decade. Moved back home about 11 years ago when my husband, who is a Mennonite pastor, again of all things, I love to blow up paradigms as a progressive Mennonite pastor's wife running for Congress in 2018 in Lancaster County. But he came back home to take a job here, and my family is still here, and so we moved back. And since 2010, I've been the executive director of Assets, the organization that Pete described, and was proud to take that from an organization serving 150 people a year, entrepreneurs and small business owners, to 1,500 when we left, when I took a leave of absence to run for office last year. We have a couple board members in the audience. Liz Martin is a board member. Rick Oppenheimer is a board member. Am I missing anyone else who's in the room who's a board member of Assets? They can tell you more. It's a great organization. Really, with how do we use the power of business? How do we use the power of the private sector to make our community stronger, to make our economy stronger, to create better jobs, to do everything we can to make a shift to make things work more. And part of the reason that I'm standing in front of you today and taking a leap to run for federal office is because it felt increasingly like all the work that we're doing, innovating with business, innovating in the nonprofit sector, taking risks, trying new things, taking the work that we did with businesses like Pete's to say, how do you look at every part of your business to be a better employer, pay better wages, hire people with barriers to employment, to see if we can shift things. Because we started looking at things like the poverty rate in Lancaster City and saw that it's 30%, if you didn't know that, which is higher than Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, on par with every other small city in our region. And it's actually gone up 50% since the year 2000. So as somebody who's devoting my life to economic development and trying to create economic opportunity through our private sector, to see us going in the wrong direction by spades really starts making you scratch your head and say, what's going on? Where are we seeing failures with this? We know that poverty rate went up because of the loss of good paying manufacturing jobs available to folks without college degrees and the replacing of those jobs with lower paying service jobs. Kathy could talk to you all day about this, and I've had the privilege of working with her in the Workforce Development Board for years now. Because there's good, smart people trying to come up with solutions on the ground to deal with what we have to work with. But it's not enough. I just felt increasingly like I was working my heart out, helping other people work their hearts out, and we're not getting further ahead. And so have you ever heard that saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu? Right? It's sort of rung true for me more and more that, okay, if not us, who, right? And why not me? Stepping up to say, can we make policies? All these things I'm talking about could be influenced with federal policy. If we had more folks who knew what it was like for working folks struggling day to day, helping to write the rules of the economy to make it work. So that's what we're up to. And I think that this election shows kind of a broader choice that we have in this moment in this country. We have a choice in this country, we have a choice here in Lancaster County between a politics of fear, scarcity, division, labeling, name calling, pitting neighbor against neighbor and saying, you know, if you don't look like me or you don't come from where I come from, then you're the problem, rather than saying, how do we actually come up with real ideas that create a country that works for all of us? How do we have a rising tide that lifts all boats? How do we talk about policies that are going to work for all of us? So that's what I'm trying to do. And the policies that we talk about and that are the top of the list, and these aren't all of them by any means, and I'm glad to hear any other questions you have about that. But the number one thing I hear as we get out there on the campaign trail, talk to voters, talk to people in their homes, talk to people on the phone, at the doors, healthcare. That in the richest country in the world, I believe healthcare should be a right and not a privilege. As simple as that. I think that you shouldn't go bankrupt when you get sick. We are the only industrialized country on earth who does not guarantee health care to our citizens. And so you can make a moral case for this, but I think you can also make a business and economic case for this. The entrepreneurs that I've talked to who have a great idea, who decide not to start that business, not to leave their employer-sponsored health care and start that business, it's because they can't afford to make that leap and be on their own as a self-employed person. And the ACA was an attempt, but it wasn't enough, and it wasn't a fix to the challenge that we have with healthcare. Entrepreneurs, business owners who close their businesses and go work for someone else even when they don't want to, just to be able to afford healthcare. To me, that's a big issue that we should be talking about. This isn't gonna happen overnight, but I think that when you spend twice the average of every other rich country on earth for healthcare and yet leave millions of people behind, we should be talking about better ideas. So that's what we're trying to do. I think when America works for all of us, we invest in education, in things like debt-free public college, so that students can come out without tens of thousands of dollars in debt. Not tuition-free, debt-free. How do we make sure that students can work and come out without debt? This includes things like expanding Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology in Lancaster City. They could grow tenfold, folks, and still not meet the needs of private employers in Lancaster County for their graduates. Average starting salary for the graduate is about $50,000 a year. To me, that's about the pathway to the middle class, pathway to the American dream, and what our employers are asking for, which is a well-trained workforce. We can do that, but it's a choice. I think when America works for all of us, we invest in infrastructure and roads and bridges that create the conditions for business to flourish, in a Green New Deal to make a shift away from fossil fuel infrastructure to a renewable infrastructure. And if you saw the news this week about climate change, that has got to be top of the list about what we're talking about and how we make a shift in our economy that's going to work for the long term. And last thing I'll say about policy, I think when America works for all of us, we fix our campaign finance system. So as a first-time candidate, I can tell you I have learned probably maybe the most about healthcare, second most about campaign finance. And so the influence of big money in our politics is sobering. It is troubling to see how much special interests influence who gets elected and how campaigns are run. So we've tried to make a commitment to walk the talk on this, made a commitment to not take any corporate PAC money, because I think elected officials should start as candidates being accountable to people, first and foremost, over special interests. And so the good news in that is that we've actually raised more money than any Democrat ever has in the seat that's centered on Lancaster, even though it's now redistricted, if you followed that too. It's a different district than it was when we started. But we've made history, and our average contribution is $35. So that says that we have this grassroots support from across this district, across the state, and even across the country of folks who share our values and want to see these changes. And so the other things I'll say just briefly before we do Q&A, we're trying to run a different kind of campaign. Most congressional campaigns raise a bunch of money, find somebody who's wealthy and well-connected to run. I'm well-connected, but definitely not wealthy. And to raise as much as you can to buy a bunch of TV ads to further polarize, right? To smear your opponent, to say things that are stretches, if not blatantly untrue. And instead, what we're trying to do is show up and build an unprecedented field strategy where we talk to people like old school politics, get out there, knock on doors, make phone calls, engage people in the political process. Because I also think when we're not engaged in our democracy is exactly when it doesn't work. So I'm proud that we have built a campaign where we've had thousands of people volunteer. 80 to 90% of the people who have stepped up have never been involved in the political process before other than voting. That's amazing. This past summer, we had 60 young people who were interns with our campaign who spent time, a lot of them couldn't even vote yet, high school students, invested in what we're doing because they believe in it and they know that their future's on the line and at stake. We're building infrastructure to make long-term political change in this region, which is amazing, and I'm proud of it. And we've built something that I don't think we've seen in Lancaster County before, which is about how we get out and talk to people. We're talking to independents, we're talking to Democrats who don't vote in midterm elections, and we're talking to Republicans. And just to tell you very briefly, this is our whole pathway to win as a Democrat in the 11th District, which is not friendly to a Democrat in terms of registration numbers. We've got to make sure that Democrats who don't vote, it's about half of the registered Democrats don't vote in a midterm election. Turnout rates are terrible, so engaging with them is key. 15% of the electorate are independents, so engaging with them is key. I've talked to so many independents who have never had a campaign come to their door and actually ask for their vote and ask for what concerns them. And we talk to Republicans because we know that the party dynamics right now in this country are unlike maybe anything we've ever seen. And it's creating an opening to do politics differently. I know in a two-party system you have to run as one or the other, so I take that a little bit lightly. I'm running as a Democrat, but I'm actually showing up more like an independent because I think we have a lot of opportunity to welcome people in and to vote our values, to vote our ideas, to vote our ideals, rather than just party politics and straight registrations. So that's what this is about. I think that we can make America work for all of us and have our values represented in the process, but we're going to have to do politics differently to get there. So thank you for having me.
Jess, thank you very much. So that you all know, this was to be a debate, but unfortunately, Congressman Smucker declined to come today. That being said, I do have some questions that I'd like to ask. I know better than to debate you, so I'll just ask the questions. Expand a little bit on Medicare. Where do you see that going?
Absolutely. So I think it's important to think about how our current healthcare system works. When you have a private insurance company-driven healthcare system, you have to know that we spend 25 to 30% of each dollar spent goes to overhead to those companies, to Aetna and to the big companies that sit at the top of Fortune 500, that are to CEO salaries, corporate shareholder profits, to marketing, to advertising, to duplicative administration, to fighting back and forth with all the billing claims that they do with the providers. Somebody has to pay for that. We're paying for that. We also aren't negotiating with big pharmaceutical companies for better prescription drug prices. We are the only rich country on earth that does not negotiate for with pharmaceuticals to get better pricing. So those are key places where we can see some savings. If you look at Medicare, it's the closest thing we have to a single payer system where we're just shifting, your hospital stays the same, your doctor stays the same, but we're shifting how you pay for it. Take the insurance company out of the equation and grow the Medicare side, which has a 1% to 2% overhead. So to me, this is about how do we make sure that we get coverage to everyone in a way that makes sense, that's efficient, that's effective. We know it's not going to happen overnight because it's 18% of our GDP, but we need to make a shift, and if we keep on this current trajectory, to me, it just makes no sense. If you look at the way the rest of the world operates and how they guarantee health care to their citizens, every single one of them uses a single payer kind of approach. There are slightly different ways you can structure it, but generally it's the same, and it ends up then costing taxpayers less out of pocket to make sure that you have coverage, everyone in our country has coverage. We have preventative care, we take care of things on the front end rather than when somebody gets sick, they go to the emergency room, which we know happens today, which is incredibly more expensive than it is to be preemptive and preventative in care. So just as a snapshot, that's kind of the model of it. I would argue, if you're looking at the whole country right now, 70% of us, according to Reuters and a poll that was just released less than a couple weeks ago, 70% of us agree with Medicare for all, including a majority of Republicans. I am seeing this on the campaign trail. I'm seeing the number of medical providers, medical professionals, doctors that agree with this approach and say we have to get there. And the number of small business owners and Republicans who share this belief, because y'all know the prices are going up and up and up, and that it's hard to stabilize that if we don't actually have a plan that makes sense. So this to me is what makes the most sense. I am very open to hearing better ideas. I have yet to hear one.
Thank you. Congressman Smucker says he's going to preserve Social Security, but he signed on to Speaker Ryan's plan to turn it into personal investment accounts.
Yeah.
What's your plan?
So currently Social Security has $1 trillion surplus. I think if we can fix any what's the word I'm looking for? Projected shortfalls, if we fix the cap, fix the structure. So I would remove the cap to make sure that everyone pays their fair share to Social Security. If we do, that's basically what we need to do to make sure that it's solvent. I am opposed to privatizing it. I'm opposed to privatizing things that are pure public goods, because I think when we do that, when you see that, you often see either increased costs because of that the same overview with insurance at this case. There's money that goes off to profit. You don't get better service necessarily. You either pay more for that or you have lower quality services in return. And I think that applies to the same thing with Social Security.
Provided that you're elected, you'd have 2 years and you would sit on committees and you'd introduce bills. What committees would you like to sit on, and what bills are in your head right now?
So committees, you don't really get your choice in this, but the things that I would be most interested in, first one is a little bit wonky, but it's the subcommittee for antitrust, which is a subcommittee of the judiciary. So antitrust, I grew up in a small business, and I remember the day that my mom found out that she could buy a can of paint cheaper at Home Depot than she could at our locally owned independent distributor. To me, that is one example of the growth of corporate monopoly power in this country. We have laws on the books that are 125 years old that are trying to keep in check, trying to create a level playing field for the little guy. That's how we grew such a diversified economy. That's how we grew such a robust small business culture in this company. And we have seen an unprecedented spike in mergers and acquisitions and the growth of huge companies. Look at Amazon, look at Walmart, look at a lot of our financial companies. You can just see that integration, the merger, the vertical integration, and the influence those companies have over the market and also over our political system is very troubling to me. And I think it's something we should all be looking at and all be talking about. So that's one committee that I think would be very interesting, and from a small business perspective, one that I'd be very committed to serve on, because I think some of the biggest competitors to small business today are how small businesses can compete with those big business interests like that. Along with that, the Committee for Small Business and Committee on Workforce would be things that are really, really interesting, and I'd love to take the ideas. I wish I could bring Kathy back up here to talk about the things we've been trying to work on in Lancaster as an outgrowth of the Mayor's Commission to Combat Poverty. The title of that job, or the title of that report that we did, that came out of 2 years of digging into why does Lancaster have a 30% poverty rate? How can we shift it? Was called One Good Job. How do we make sure that there are more good jobs available, and we know that there are today, and that the people who need them most are connected to those jobs and prepared for those jobs? Workforce is a key part of that, but the other big missing ingredients include transportation, childcare, and those kind of supports that make sure that workers can get to the jobs that are available and be successful as they get into it. So I'd love to bring what we've seen at a local level into national policy making to make smarter decisions that match up with actually what works on the ground and what's missing in the ingredients on the ground.
Well, there are a bunch of bills floating around out there, and one of them is the Stop Dangerous Sanctuary Cities Act that was introduced last year. This bill prohibits a sanctuary jurisdiction from receiving grants under certain economic development assistance programs and the Community Development Block Grant Program. A sanctuary jurisdiction is a state or political subdivision that has a statute, policy, or practice in effect that, among other things, prohibits or restricts information being shared about immigrants. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. So I think it's important to understand how a bill like that works. And the concerns that I have with it around how it's a punitive bill that punishes cities who decide to enforce things differently. And so when I think about how, our mayor and police force in Lancaster City work and operate, and the policies that they put into place to try to have more relationship with people, with our citizens, to build trust in our communities, I think a bill like this is troublesome because it actually puts an onus on our local police force to overstep how they would traditionally police and break down trust in the community. So I think in some ways we end up being less safe because community members don't trust the police in the same way. We have to think about some unintended consequences like that change the conditions for what police are already facing on the ground in the cities. So I think I would not be a supporter of that bill. I'm definitely, a supporter of the immigration laws that we have and that we're enforcing and that we should continue to enforce. But I think doing that, shifting that, is overreach from the federal government, infringing on local government's rights.
Just one more. As Congresswoman, you're going to be dealing with some very weighty issues, and one of them is oversight of presidential powers. And the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act was introduced in 2017. It's floating around out there now. This bill prohibits the president from using the armed forces to conduct a first-use nuclear strike unless such strike is conducted pursuant to a congressional declaration of war expressly authorizing such a strike. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. So I think ever since George Bush II, we saw it with Obama and we're seeing it again with Trump. I am concerned about executive action around taking war, declaring war, including preemptive nuclear strikes. So to me, this is something that I think Congress needs to retain as per the Constitution, that Congress should make a deliberative decision when we decide to go to war, when we decide to send servicemen and women into harm's way, when we decide to influence other countries, again, potentially preemptively. That's a really important deliberative decision that should happen. And one of the things I'm proud to have gotten the endorsement of various veterans groups, partly because I think we share the belief that international military intervention should be the last thing that we ever do. We should be investing in diplomacy. We should be investing in relationships. Our current Secretary of Defense talks about the fact that for every dollar in State Department funding that's cut, you have to buy more bullets for the Department of Defense. We've seen a 30% reduction in Department of State funding under the current administration, which I think is scary. We've also seen an increase in Department of Defense spending. And so this also brings up to me, what we saw Dwight Eisenhower talk about when he was leaving office in 1961, that beware the military-industrial complex, right? And the growth of how we spend military dollars. Right now, we've seen an unprecedented growth since 9/11, with not necessarily the results that we want to see out of that level of spending in international affairs, are we seeing what we want to see? Is it working the way we want to see it work? I think we need to make sure that we're investing in diplomacy and State Department and investing on that side as much or more as we are with the military.
Thank you. I'm going to hand this over to Brad, and hopefully we can have some questions from Rotarians.
We probably have time for one or two.
Okay. President Althea says we have time for one or two.
Jess, I'm surprised you don't have a crown on your head. I've seen you in a crown the past couple of days.
Right?
Stupid happening.
Politics as usual.
Our existing congressman, I think, has voted for everything the party bosses have told him to vote on.
Yeah.
What, if you're elected, how are you going to deal with your party bosses on the Democratic side, and hopefully won't vote for everything they tell you to vote
Absolutely not. So I have said this before, and I say it proudly. I would not vote for Nancy Pelosi. I think it's time for new leadership in the Democratic Party. So go ahead and try to pin that on me on one of his next commercials. You heard it here. You know, like I said before, running in a district like this, I'm trying to show up more like an independent. I do believe that both parties at the national level have failed us. They've sold out to special interests. They are not reflecting the ideas and the needs and concerns of working families in this country. That is hugely problematic and concerning. And I think part of the steep partisanship that we have in this moment is about blind party loyalty. I think we need to stand up for our values and to talk about where we want to go that's common sense and is bipartisan in nature. We've had moments like that in the past. We need to get back to that. And I think I'm in a unique position as a Democrat running an insurgent campaign in a very Republican-heavy area. We've gotten zero help from the National Democratic Party. We owe them nothing. We are running our own campaign, and we are making waves and making history in a lot of ways already, just with the records that we're hitting with this. We do know that they're taking note of our campaign. I hope that if we pull this off, and even if we don't win, the things that we're building in the process, I think will help inform the flawed logic within the parties into how you run. I think, we had a debate with Congressman Smucker on Monday night. And if you didn't watch it, go watch it. It's about a place where we're sharing ideas. He's been very reticent to come out and to talk and debate in public, as evidenced in today. I think it's the title of the job. I think that our responsibility is to show up and talk to people. I've been proud to do more than 52 public town hall meetings to talk to constituents, regardless of party, to hear ideas, to hear questions. He hasn't had one. I think that's problematic when we're talking about how we transcend politics as usual and blind party loyalty to actually hear what people are saying regardless of party. Some of the richest conversation I've had has been with Republican committee members, with Republican poll greeters when we were going out to the polls, and I've told Chet this, that his poll greeters were wonderful people that we really enjoyed talking to on election day. I've loved to talk to Republicans that come to our events to ask questions about policy and our values. And I think that that's what this should be about. And I'm not afraid to have those conversations. And I don't think that Congressman Smucker should be either.
Hi, Jess, and thanks for coming. So actually following right off of that, so I think that's great that you're focused on your values. I also think there are a lot of recent examples where Republican leadership is very effective at getting what they want in the way of a political outcome, even when the popular opinion doesn't reflect popular opinion and the values of most people in this country. How prepared do you think you are to actually be effective in the political arena where being right doesn't necessarily mean you win?
Sure. So we've been having conversations with current members of Congress, with other people that are running. I think part of this is about seeing who wins. What is the sort of complexion of Congress after November or after January? What do we look like? Who's there? Where are the majorities? That being said, if we win this seat, again, as a Democrat running in a heavily Republican seat, to show up more like an independent, I feel like we get a lot of opportunity to say, listen, it's very likely that I'm going to vote more in line with Democrats than I will with Republicans, at least with the things that I'm campaigning on and the things that I hold dear. But you can't count on that Democratic Party. You can't count on that Republican Party. So let's actually talk about things. Let's talk about what's at stake in our districts. What do our constituents want to see happen versus are special interests that fund so many campaigns. So I take this back too, when we're talking about how we have more bipartisanship, and I would encourage everyone to dig into how campaign finance works, how elected officials are being influenced, especially by special interest money. You can track and see, how are people voting? And you can look at this directly with Congressman Smucker. How are you voting? How are you deciding to show up? Who are you working for when most of your money comes from corporate PACs and special interests versus people? And so for me, that's my commitment. I think elected officials should be accountable to people. They should work for us and not for special interests. That's a big part of why things aren't working in Washington. And is that it? I think we have time. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.